In August of 1994, a police officer in the tiny town of Oakville, Washington, was driving his patrol car on a typical overnight shift. Since basically everybody in town was asleep, there really wasn't much to report, so the work was fairly tedious. At about 3 a.m., as he was sitting in his car, it started to rain. The officer was used to the dreary Pacific Northwest weather and turned on his windshield wipers. But as the blades began swiping from side to side, his windshield only seemed to get dirtier instead of clearer. Eventually, a film covered all but a small portion of the officer's windshield, and so he slowed his cruiser to a crawl. Then he positioned himself so he could look out the one clean spot in his windshield and carefully drove over to the nearest gas station. Clearly, he needed new wiper blades. However, when the officer stepped out of his cruiser to see what was actually clouding his windshield, he made an unsettling discovery. What was on his windshield was not the typical grime that splashes off the roads. Instead, what was on there looked like some kind of clear, slimy coating. The officer ran his finger over the material, and it felt gooey, almost like jello. He looked up at the sky and thought, what in the world is going on here? From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. So, if you like today's story, tape "Use Other Door" signs on every exterior door in the Follow Buttons workplace. This episode is called Death from Above. One morning in May of 1994, a woman named Erica Carver was kneeling in her mom's garden in Oakville, Washington, pulling at the stubborn weeds at her feet. The tomato seedlings she'd carefully planted just a week or two ago were already being engulfed by thistle and other weeds. Erica hoped they'd survive into the summer, but the weeds grew so fast. She'd been at it all morning, helping her 64-year-old mom, Maggie, prepare the vegetable garden for the warmer months. All the rain they got up here was a blessing and a curse. It helped turn the whole farm lush and green, but that meant a lot of work mowing grass and pulling weeds. Erica wiped the sweat off her brow and then gave one final tug on a giant thistle still rooted to the ground. Just then, Erica heard a thumping noise, and this noise, which was sort of constant, got louder and louder like it was getting closer. A moment later, Erica looked up to see what was making the thumping noise. Two enormous black helicopters appeared just above the tree line. The cows started shuffling nervously and some began to moo as the helicopters flew over them. The choppers were moving so slowly that Erica thought it almost looked like they were searching for something on the ground. She turned to her mother and asked her if she knew what was going on. But Maggie just shrugged and continued weeding. Without even glancing up at the sky, she told her daughter that helicopters had actually been doing flyovers in the area for months now. Nobody really seemed to know what they were doing, but they seemed harmless. Erica watched the helicopters until they disappeared into the distance. It definitely did not seem like a regular flyover to her. But if her mom wasn't worried, Erica wasn't going to dwell on it either. So Erica got back on the ground and kept tending the garden. About 4 months later, on the morning of August 7th, 1994, Erica peered out the window of her mother's farmhouse on another rainy day. It had taken some time for Erica to get used to the Washington weather after moving here from the Arizona desert to help her mother now that Maggie was getting a bit older. But Erica had come to like the wet climate. And as she looked out the window, she could see that all the rain she was starting to like had given them an abundance of tomatoes. Erica went out to the kitchen to make herself some coffee before she began her chores for the day. But as soon as she got to the kitchen, her mother's dogs burst inside, followed by her mother, whose face was as white as a sheet. Erica shouted over the dogs, who were barking like crazy, and asked her mother what was going on. Maggie said she had let the dogs out while there was a lull in the storm, and when she was over near the barn, Maggie said she noticed there were all these strange things all over the box of firewood. They almost looked like hailstones, but when she touched one, it felt soft and jiggly. Erica was very confused by this and just went outside to see for herself. As she walked to the barn, sure enough, Erica saw dozens of small, transparent, gelatinous blobs covering the ground. And as Erica neared the box of firewood that her mom had referenced, she saw that it was covered in these strange objects. Erica walked over to the garden, and she saw the plants were also drenched in this slimy goop, as though it had rained transparent slime. And so Erica looked up at the sky, and then back down at the tomatoes and lettuce, and wondered if it was even safe to eat the vegetables now. Erica hurried back inside and found the phone number for the Department of Agriculture. But when she spoke with a representative about this goo, he did not seem too concerned. He said he didn't have an explanation for what the goo was. Sure, it did sound totally weird, but also it was very likely harmless. Toxic substances did not rain from the sky like that. Whatever this goo was, the next rain would very likely wash it off the crops and everything would go back to normal. But Erica wasn't so sure. After she got off the call with this representative, she called her brother, James, who was a paramedic in town. And he told her he had actually seen the goo as well where he was and agreed that something didn't feel right about it. He said he had gotten reports that this stuff had been falling all over Oakville, and he'd even heard over his emergency scanner that a local police officer had had to pull over on the road because his cruiser had suddenly become covered in it and he couldn't even see. James told his sister that he was actually off for the day and said he would come over and they could try to figure out what this was together. A little later that day, Erica and her mother sat in the living room with James. And Erica told her brother that the Department of Agriculture guy had said the goo was harmless and therefore, the crops were fine to eat. But James agreed with Erica. He wasn't sure the crops were actually safe to eat, despite what this guy said. And they couldn't be positive until they knew more about the goo. And so Erica and James decided to go outside to have a closer look, and just in case this stuff was actually dangerous, they told their mom to just stay inside. Once the brother and sister were out in the yard, James reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 sets of latex gloves. Erica had asked him to bring them over as a precaution. Back in Arizona, Erica had worked for the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, and so she knew from experience that unknown substances should be handled with care until they knew for sure that it was not toxic. Erica kneeled down next to some of the goo, James right beside her, and carefully she scooped up one of the blobs into a glass jar. The transparent, viscous goo wasn't moving on its own, but when she touched it, it jiggled, almost like jello. Over the next few minutes, they scooped up enough of these blobs to fill up the jar, and there were still countless more of these small gelatinous globs all over the yard. Erica put the lid back on the jar and then held the jar up to the sunlight. She could see the blobs were completely transparent, like aloe vera gel. Erica was fascinated. She had always been curious by nature, and her old job with OSHA had really taught her to think like a scientist. So she decided to do a little experiment. Back inside, Erica set up a makeshift laboratory in the kitchen. She placed 3 bowls on the counter, one filled with water, another with rubbing alcohol, and the last was empty. Then her brother James reached into the glass jar and pulled out the first blob. She noticed it stuck to his latex gloves. Erica held her breath as James carefully placed the blob into the water bowl, and right away the blob just sort of floated on the surface. Now, this didn't answer a whole lot of questions, but what it did do is tell her that the blobs had to contain chemicals other than just water. If it was just water, it would have broken apart and dissolved inside of the water, but it didn't. And so Erica reached out and took another blob with her gloved hand and placed it into the alcohol bowl. And again, it did not dissolve. Erica urged James to be gentle as he placed the final blob into the empty bowl, and then she watched as her brother held a lighter to that blob for a few seconds. But the fire did nothing. It didn't burn the blob at all. Erica was intrigued. She was not exactly sure what any of these reactions truly meant. All she knew was that she still had no idea what the substance could be. And when she made eye contact with her brother, she could see from the expression on his face that he also was totally confused. The following day, Erica was at her mother's house when she suddenly heard a loud thud coming from her mother's bedroom. Erica ran into the room to find her mom lying on the floor with her face pale and sweaty. Erica rushed to her mother's side and cradled her mother's head, and Maggie looked back at Erica with these glazed eyes. And after she sort of composed herself, Maggie told Erica that the room had just started spinning and she felt nauseous, and then she said everything had gone black and she collapsed. Erica helped get her mother into bed and then ran to the phone to call 911. After she placed the call and was just sort of pacing around the kitchen, she spotted the jar of goo on the counter. And suddenly a thought popped into her head. Her mom had actually been the only one to touch the strange blobs without gloves on. What if these blobs had something to do with her sudden illness? Later that day, Erica paced around an exam room at the hospital. She glanced over at her mother, who was resting quietly in her hospital bed. Some of her color had returned, but Erica thought she still looked very weak. Erica shifted her attention to James, who was sitting next to their mom, inspecting the glass jar Erica had brought along with them. A moment later, a calm, young-looking physician entered the room and introduced himself as Dr. George Grant. Dr. Grant asked Maggie how she was doing, and she told him about her fainting spell. Dr. Grant nodded and thought for a second. Then when he spoke, he said based on Maggie's symptoms, it sounded like she might have an inner ear infection, which would explain the dizziness and also the nausea. He said most of the time these infections are caused by a virus, like influenza or Epstein-Barr. But Dr. Grant said he couldn't be sure without further testing. If Maggie didn't get better in a few days after managing her symptoms, he might have to order a CT scan or an MRI. In the meantime, she would stay at the hospital for monitoring. Erica felt her body tense up as the doctor spoke. She knew that it must be somewhat serious if they're having her mom stay at the hospital like this. Her gaze again turned to the jar in her brother's hands. She asked him for the container, and then turned to the doctor. Erica told the doctor about all the goo that had fallen from the sky, and how their mother had touched it with her bare hands. Erica explained that she and her brother had collected some samples of this goo that they had brought along with them in this jar. Erica asked Dr. Grant, while holding up this jar, if maybe the goo had something to do with her mother's illness. As Erica extended the jar out to him, she could see the confusion in the doctor's eyes. He said it sounded pretty unlikely, but he would be happy to run some tests on it. Erica hoped that maybe a real lab would give them some real answers. That evening, Erica and James pulled up to their mother's farmhouse. Erica slowly stepped out of the car and let out a deep sigh as they walked up to the stairs to the front door. It had been a long and draining day. All Erica could think about now was crawling into bed and falling asleep. Erica reached inside of her purse and pulled out the keys to her mother's house. But when she looked up again, her heart nearly stopped. Her mom's new kitten was sprawled out on the deck. Erica rushed over and kneeled down next to the cat, and she saw it was dead. Erica's mind raced as she looked down at this tiny, motionless creature. She didn't see any bite marks or scratches on it. In fact, the cat looked absolutely fine from the outside. If she didn't know any better, she would have thought it was just sleeping. Then a realization hit Erica. First, her mother had gotten sick, which they thought might have something to do with these blobs that apparently came out of the sky. And now her mother's kitten had died suddenly with no clear marks or injuries on it. Could its death maybe be connected to these blobs as well? Erica turned to James and asked him what he thought, and he kind of shrugged. And then Erica wondered aloud if maybe the cat had tried playing with this goo, or maybe even tried to eat it. Earlier, before they had left the hospital, Dr. Grant had told the siblings that a lab analysis showed that these blobs contained human white blood cells. However, the hospital didn't have the equipment to test for anything beyond that. Now, the white blood cells themselves were not toxic, but the doctor had no idea what else could be in these blobs, so they could definitely be harmful. And so as Erica and her brother just stood on the porch stunned, Erica thought to herself, if the blobs did kill the cat, what were they going to do to her mother? Four days later, Erica helped her mother walk up the front steps of her house. As she climbed, Maggie could only take one stair at a time. She was doing a lot better, but she still was not fully recovered. Whatever was wrong with her, it was not an inner ear infection. However, the doctors didn't know any more than that. Her discharge paperwork said that she was sick from some kind of virus. But they had nothing more to test for, and Maggie was well enough to be back on her feet, so the doctor said it was safe for her to go home. This vagueness only made Erica more suspicious about the gooey substance and the threat it might pose to the residents of Oakville. The day after she and James had found the dead kitten, Erica shipped a sample blob to the Washington State Department of Health and personally delivered a second sample to the State Department of Ecology, and she'd been waiting for the results ever since. Erica carefully guided her mother through the front door and to her bedroom, her mind still very much on the blobs. Once her mom was all settled in, Erica made her way back to the kitchen. As she filled up a glass of water to bring to her mother, the phone rang, and Erica ran and picked it up immediately. It was the Department of Ecology. Erica felt her heart start to race as she listened to the government official on the other end of the line. He told her that they had run some tests, and they determined that the goo had come from a living organism. However, the hospital lab had been wrong. The blobs did not contain any human white blood cells. The department scientist thought the blood cells had come from jellyfish. To Erica, this made zero sense, and that's what she told the scientist. The closest beach was almost 40 miles from Oakville, so how could a jellyfish, or parts of a jellyfish, fall from the sky 40 miles from the ocean? The scientist said he had no idea. He knew this explanation sounded crazy, but according to the sample, that's what it was. Erica thanked the official for looking into it, then she hung up and walked to the dining room table to sit down. As Erica rested her chin in her hands and tried to make sense of what the official had just told her, she glanced down at the day's newspaper sitting on the table, and the front page was littered with headlines about the, quote, Oakville blobs. Erica picked up the paper and began reading. People all over town had apparently been seeing these things, including that police officer James had mentioned, and it seemed like the blobs were making other people sick too. One article said that an estimated 30 Oakville residents had become ill, and they all had the same flu-like symptoms as Maggie. And as Erica kept reading, she saw that hundreds of dead crabs had washed up on a beach about 100 miles away. The paper said that a gelatinous substance had washed up alongside the crabs. At the mention of this beach, Erica's mind snapped into focus. Erica turned to another article where one scientist offered a theory that maybe a large swarm of jellyfish had been sucked up by a powerful waterspout, like a small tornado out on the ocean. The waterspout had then whirled the jellyfish around like a blender until they were reduced to small pieces and hurled up into the sky, and then those pieces rained down on Oakville. Erica still thought it was totally crazy to think these were jellyfish falling from the sky, but maybe they were. However, that still didn't explain why these blobs, whether they were jellyfish or not, had killed animals and made more than 30 humans sick. Maybe, if these really were jellyfish, it was a particular kind of jellyfish that was poisonous. Just then, Erica heard raindrops bouncing off the roof. She looked up from the paper and towards the window, and she gasped, because once again, it was raining blobs. The next day, a microbiologist named Mike McDowell peered down at the gelatinous substance resting on the petri dish. Mike was running tests on the goo samples that had been sent to the Washington Department of Health from an Oakville resident named Erica Carver. Mike had never seen anything like it before. When it came to his research and investigations, he usually had some sort of idea about what he was dealing with, but not this time. He knew some people, including scientists, had theorized that these blobs were jellyfish that had rained down from the sky, but so far, Mike hadn't found any jellyfish cells in his sample. And there also weren't any human white blood cells either. But whatever it was, he felt confident he would get to the bottom of it. Directly observing the material under a microscope had not yielded any results, so Mike had placed some samples in an incubator to see if it grew any bacteria. If it did, then maybe he could identify what type of bacteria it was, and that might shed some light on what this goo was. Finally, the sample was ready, so Mike pulled them out of the incubator, and when he did, his pulse quickened, because the sample had grown bacteria. Mike immediately performed some biochemical tests and was able to identify that this particular bacteria normally came from the digestive tract, which meant this goo had to be from some kind of an animal and might even be from a human. Mike grabbed his notepad and pencil and scribbled furiously as he worked through the implications of his discovery. How did gut bacteria end up falling from the sky? Then he had a thought. Mike wondered if these blobs were actually just toilet waste dumped from an airplane. It was possible that when the waste was stored at such high altitudes in the plane, it could turn into a jelly-like material. However, Mike realized there was at least one problem with this theory. He knew that airlines typically used blue dye to stain their toilet waste, and these blobs were completely clear. Mike sighed and walked back over to the microscope and refocused the lens on the gooey blob. As he stared at the sample through the microscope, he started to wonder if this was a man-made compound called a matrix, which is a carrier or delivery system for other chemicals. It's like an envelope you can use to contain dangerous substances without anyone detecting it. More specifically, a matrix can be used to deliver a harmful substance to an unsuspecting target. But Mike couldn't understand why there would be parts of a jellyfish or whole jellyfish or toilet waste inside of a matrix. What would the purpose be? Why would anybody do that? His mind raced as he thought through the possibilities. Then it hit him. A matrix containing dangerous elements does not just randomly appear in a rainstorm. Someone had to place it there. Mike paced around the lab as he toyed with this idea. If he was correct, then these blobs were more than just a strange phenomenon. It seemed crazy to even think about, but he couldn't help but wonder. Could it be they were some kind of bioweapon? Mike was starting to get a headache and decided he would come back to his work tomorrow. So he carefully removed the sample from the microscope, he placed it back inside the container and sealed the lid shut. Then Mike carried it to the biosafety storage facility next to his lab. The separate secure room contained a cabinet where Mike stored important samples and materials. He gingerly placed the container into the cabinet and shut the glass window. The next morning, Mike walked inside of the lab and headed over to the storage facility where he had left the sample. He entered the code, the door swung open, he reached inside for the container, but his hands came away empty. Mike peered inside. The blob was gone. Mike began walking all around the lab looking for the container, wondering if he had maybe misplaced it when he was cleaning up the night before. But as he thought about the night before, he could have sworn he put it right back where it was supposed to go. Mike was suddenly afraid. He had worked at the department for decades and never lost a sample before, especially not one that was this important. What would happen to him when they discovered he had done this? Mike finally rushed over to his supervisor's office to beg for forgiveness. However, when Mike told his supervisor what had happened, a strange look came over the man's face. His eyes locked on Mike's, and he told the scientist that it would be better not to ask any more questions. By his tone, Mike could tell that was the end of their discussion about the sample. Mike nodded and kept a straight face, but inside, he was now fuming. This was a possible bioweapon. Without that sample, he would never know what made 30 people sick and killed animals and pets. It was a crushing blow to this investigation. Not only could it have brought peace of mind to the people of Oakville, but possibly it could have exposed a dangerous weapon being used against people of this country. But as bad as all this seemed, Mike did know better than to keep asking questions. His boss had made it perfectly clear that he needed to stay out of this. And so he just had to hope that everything would be okay, and that he had not just participated in a massive government cover-up. Throughout 1994, a total of 6 storms dropped gelatinous blobs on the city of Oakville, Washington. Dozens of pets and livestock died, but thankfully, Maggie Carver and the other 30 residents who got sick after touching the blobs all recovered. Erica continued to send out samples of the blobs she had collected, hoping somebody would finally learn the truth about what they really were. But no one ever came forward with an official explanation. Theories like pulverized jellyfish or airplane waste have never been confirmed. To this day, Erica believes the full story of the blobs has never been told. Just as the scientist Mike McDowell began to suspect, Erica feels certain that these blobs might be part of some secret government experiment. After learning about McDowell's theory that the blobs could be some kind of bioweapon, Erica thought back to the black unmarked helicopters she saw over her mother's farm that summer. Those kinds of helicopters are frequently associated with secret government projects, and so she wondered if they had something to do with these blobs. It just seemed like too much of a coincidence for them not to. But like all the other theories around these blobs, this one has also never been confirmed. She and her family still don't know why those helicopters were flying slowly over the area around the same time the blobs fell. And so for now, the Oakville blobs remain an enduring mystery. During a busy 2009 weekend on a popular river in Florida, 2 boats collided. Within minutes, one of them, a 40-foot-long pleasure craft, had sank. Luckily, all the passengers on both boats survived, but unluckily, where the sunk boat finally landed underwater was not very deep, and it was just barely outside of a main shipping channel, which meant if it didn't get moved, someone was eventually going to run into it. The marina owner contacted a local commercial diver and asked him if he would come out and lift this boat up and move it. But that diver was not going to be available for several weeks, and he was asking for too much money. So the marina owner reached out to another local diver, a guy by the name of Tim, and offered him the job. Tim was not a commercial diver. He was a 43-year-old recreational diver who was well known in the area, and had lots of diving experience. But in terms of experience lifting 40-foot crafts off the bottom of the river, Tim had no experience. But Tim was excited at this challenge being presented to him, and so he accepted the deal and offered to do it for half the money the commercial diver was asking for. Even though Tim had never raised a boat before, he knew it was going to require a lot of lift bags around the boat. Lift bags are like these big, durable balloons that you can inflate and deflate underwater. But before Tim could just go down and start placing these bags, he needed to do a survey dive where he just went down and checked out the wreckage, saw it for himself, and figured out how many lift bags he would need and where he would place them. So on September 12th, Tim threw all of his dive gear into his truck, he left the marina and drove over to a parking lot that butted up against the shipping channel. Tim hopped out, leaving his gear in the truck. He walked down to the edge of the riverbank and he scanned out across the river looking for the buoy that the marina owner had told him was out there, designating where the shipwreck was. Once he found it and saw that it was not very far from where he was, he just walked back up to his truck, grabbed his gear, came back down to the water's edge. He jocked up, then hopped in the water and swam out to the buoy. Once he was there, he placed his diver down flag on the buoy. This is a flag that signifies to anybody in the area that there is a diver below them, and then he made his descent. Tim didn't expect to be underwater for very long, and because he was a very experienced diver, he probably thought this dive was going to be extremely routine. And so for those reasons, he had elected not to bring a dive partner with him. This is a huge no-no in the diving community, especially if you're going to be diving in a hazardous environment like a shipwreck. But Tim was confident, so he broke that rule. One of the pieces of gear that Tim had brought with him was a diver propulsion vehicle, or DPV for short. These DPVs come in all shapes and sizes, but what you should picture in your head is like a little torpedo with a propeller on the back, and the diver holds on to this torpedo and controls the speed using a throttle and basically just rockets around underwater. The current in the river that Tim was going to be in was fairly strong, and so Tim brought his DPV to help him stay near the shipwreck as he inspected it. After Tim went subsurface, he grabbed his scooter and began going straight down, and the water was not very clear, so he couldn't see the shipwreck at first. But after going down about 50 feet, he saw this beautiful boat. It was perched on its side on this fairly steep embankment with its nose pointing in the direction the current was flowing. Right away, Tim got to work swimming around the shipwreck, looking for different points on the boat where he could attach lift bags and marking those locations on his diver's slate, which is like a dry erase board. But after going around the boat several times, Tim had not seen the actual impact site on the side of the boat that caused it to sink in the first place, and he wondered if it was hidden on the side of the boat that was laying in the sand. And so Tim decided he wanted to go down and have a look, and so he went down to where the sand met the boat, but as soon as he got down there, he kicked up all the mud and the sand and it killed his visibility. And so he grabbed onto the side of the boat and he picked up his DPV and turned it on with the propellers pointed back towards where the mud and the sand was. And he kind of used the propellers of the DPV like a leaf blower and blew the mud and sand out of his field of vision. And it worked great, but he couldn't see the impact site. And so he got underneath the boat and got closer and closer to where the actual metal of the boat was pressing up against the sand and just continued to blow away the mud and sand to get a better look, when all of a sudden the ship lurched forward and came to a stop on Tim's legs. He couldn't move, he was totally trapped. When Tim had used his DPV to clear away the mud and sand, he had also blown away some of the mud and sand that was keeping the boat from sliding farther down the embankment. And so when it got blown away, the boat became unsteady and it came to rest on top of Tim. When Tim was not able to pull his legs out from under this incredibly heavy boat, he most likely used the DPV to continue to erode the mud and sand around the boat to try to get it to continue to slide down off of his legs. But he wasn't able to do that because the boat was basically wedged up against his legs. Tim's legs were the thing keeping the boat from sliding any farther. And because Tim did not bring a dive partner, there was literally no one there to save him. And even though he had told the marina owner that he was going out to survey the wreck, he had not given his timeline, so no one was expecting him. And so he would have realized very quickly that there was virtually nothing he could do but wait to die. Several hours later, someone on the surface noticed Tim's diver down flag on that buoy and called in the authorities. When the fire department's dive team went down to the wreckage, they found Tim. He was still trapped underneath the boat. He had run out of air and he had drowned. Our next story is called Swiss Cheese. Situated an hour's drive from Johannesburg in South Africa lies Sterkfontein Cave. The cave is famous for the fossils that have been found there and also for its underground lake, whose walls look like Swiss cheese. There's all these tunnels that spider all over the place. Many of them are unexplored, and no one knows how deep the cave actually goes. In 1984, cave diver Peter Verhussel, along with two of his friends, decided they wanted to explore these passageways in the lake, and specifically they wanted to check out a chamber called Milner Hall, which was fairly far down in the lake. There was a guideline that was anchored from the surface of the lake all the way down into the different sections that had been explored, and this was so cave divers could hold on to it and make their way through without getting lost. Not that I've ever been cave diving, but from what I've read, there is one golden rule. You never let go of the guideline. And if you do, it better be extremely well planned, and you should do it with other divers present. Peter was a notorious risk taker and was the least experienced cave diver of the three. When they entered the lake, they were all holding the guideline, and Peter was the third back. And so they began descending down into the lake, and at some point, Peter's curiosity got the better of him, and he left the line to go look at the wall where there was, something he wanted to look at. And luckily, the other two divers noticed it, they saw him, and they swam over and got him and brought him back to the guideline. And even though you can't communicate underwater, I'm sure they looked at him like, come on, don't do that. And they kept going down, and then once again, Peter's curiosity gets the better of him. He leaves the guideline and goes over and checks something else out. The other two divers notice again, they turn around, they grab him, and they pull him back. And now they're looking at him like, you can't do this, no more. And so Peter's body language indicated that he got it and he was back on the guideline. He's not going to do it again. And they continue down and they're getting closer to Milner Hall when the first two turn around to check on Peter and he's gone. And now previously when they found him those other two times when he left the guideline, he was just over right against the wall and he was easy to spot. But this time he wasn't. They're looking around with their lights and he's nowhere to be found. And they're not prepared to go leave into one of these tunnels to go looking for him because there were so many. It was like Swiss cheese down there with all these different tunnels he could have gone into, and they didn't know which one he went in. And so after kind of waiting and looking around for a couple of minutes, thinking maybe he'll come back, they were running out of air and they had to go to the surface. So the two men surface, they call the police, they explain what happened. Rescue divers are sent to the cave to go looking for Peter, but by the time they even got there, it had been several hours. It takes a while to mount this type of search. And Peter only had one tank of air. And so if he hasn't surfaced by now, the thought is he's drowned at this point. But the rescue divers go into the lake, they head down to the area where Peter was last seen, and they look around and they can't find him, and they surface pretty quickly, and they say, look, we're just not prepared to look through all these different tunnels he could have gone in just to find his body. Because at this point, there's no way he's alive. He's been down here for hours, he doesn't have enough air, and one of the rescue divers is going to get trapped in one of these tunnels, and we don't want to lose anyone, so we're terminating the search. Peter's friends are devastated, and they say, hey, can you let us go down and look for Peter's body for his family? And the police said, no, we're banning diving in this cave. 6 weeks after Peter went missing inside of this lake, a group of dry cavers were doing some work in a chamber that was right next to this underground lake. And they were chiseling this wall when all of a sudden the wall kind of collapsed, revealing another chamber on the other side of this wall. They took their flashlight out and they looked inside, and it looked like a tunnel that kind of weaved around the corner. And they shined their light on the ground, and it looked like there were some muddy or sandy footprints that were left as if someone had been walking right there. The cavers were initially terrified, the idea that there's anything living behind the walls inside of a cave. But they stepped over and they walked around the corner, and it revealed this huge air pocket that clearly was connected to the underground lake because there was water right in the middle of this air pocket and there was no other way in besides, this wall that's collapsed. And in the middle of the water, there was this island. It was like this sandy, muddy, rocky island right in the middle of this air pocket. And laying on the island was Peter. In a stroke of luck, after Peter went missing from his dive, he had discovered this air pocket, and he had surfaced and climbed onto this island. He knew he didn't have enough air in his air tank to get to the surface again, and so he figured, okay, I'll just sit on this island. There seems to be enough air in here for me. I'll wait until my dive buddies invariably go get help and come down here and rescue me. He sat inside of that air pocket for 3 weeks, waiting for a rescue that never arrived. Before he ultimately died of starvation, he wrote a message in the sand to his mother and to his wife, telling them that he loved them. To this day, diving is still prohibited inside of Sterkfontein Cave.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Birth Number 6.
At 4 a.m. on February 25th, 2022, a 36-year-old father of 3 named Christopher Boudram woke up inside of his modest home in Pointe-à-Pierre, which is a city on the Caribbean island of Trinidad and Tobago. After quietly getting out of his bed so as not to wake up his wife, who was still asleep, Christopher walked into the other room and did his typical morning exercise routine, and then afterward, he made himself some breakfast in the kitchen, and by 5:30 a.m., he was out his front door, into his car, making the commute to work. Christopher was a professional scuba diver, and he had been for over 10 years. Commercial diving is a very broad field to work in, but generally, it meant that Christopher was paid to do various tasks underwater, things like inspections or welding, or just moving equipment around. For the last 8 months, Christopher had been fortunate enough to be working for a company that was located just 2 minutes' drive from his house. It was an oil and gas company called Perea Fuel. And Christopher's duties at Perea Fuel centered primarily on the upkeep and maintenance of several of these underwater pipelines that Perea Fuel used to get the oil off of their ships and onto land where it could be processed. These underwater pipelines, of which Perea had at least 6, were basically U-shaped. They had these 2 vertical sections on either end that would jut out of the water. And then connecting these 2 vertical sections was a 1,200-foot long section of pipe that ran along the seabed at roughly 60 feet below the surface. And so one of these vertical sections was out at sea, so 1,200 feet off the coast, and ships would literally come by this opening to the pipe that was out of the water, and they would dump their oil into this opening. The oil would go down, it would shoot across this long horizontal section, and then go up the other vertical section much closer to shore, where workers could collect the oil and bring it onto land to be processed. So on this particular day in February of 2022, when Christopher arrived at Perea Fuel, he was not surprised at all to find out that he and his diving colleagues would be doing some maintenance on one of these underwater pipelines. However, there was something unique about the particular pipeline they'd be working on. It was called Berth Number 6, and unlike the rest of Perea Fuel's underwater oil transport pipelines, this one had not been active since 2018. So for the past 4 years, it had just sat idle. Now, this was on purpose. For whatever reason, the company had decided not to use Berth Number 6, and so they put it into a sort of storage mode, where the vertical section of Berth Number 6 that was out at sea was untouched. It was still just poking out of the water, no changes. However, the other vertical section of Berth Number 6 that was closest to shore was first plugged up, like imagine putting a cork inside of a wine bottle. That's basically what they did to this vertical section, except they used this huge inflatable cork. Imagine like a huge pool toy. They basically jammed it inside of the vertical section, and then they inflated it so much that it was completely airtight inside of this pipe. And then once it was all plugged up, they submerged this section of the vertical pipe underwater, maybe 5 or 10 feet below the surface, to kind of keep it out of the way of all the ships that would be moving around close to shore. And then also what they did is they put something called a habitat on top of the opening of this now submerged vertical section of berth number 6. To understand it, you got to picture something else. Okay, so imagine you're in the bathtub and you have a bucket and you flip it upside down above the surface, so there's nothing inside of the bucket, and you just take the bucket and push it straight down into the water. No matter how deep you push that bucket, as long as you don't rotate it to one side or the other and you just keep it steady, that air pocket inside of the bucket will remain. You can literally reach your hand under the bucket underwater and it will be dry. And so basically, that's what this habitat was. Korea Fuel took a huge bucket, if you will, and they lowered it straight into the water and pressed it down and anchored it right above the opening to this submerged vertical section. So there was a permanent air pocket over the opening to this pipe. And the reason for this is because if they needed to do work on this pipe, like for example, today they wanted Christopher and his colleagues to make this pipe active again, which meant doing work on it, the divers could swim down, get inside of this habitat, stand on the little metal platform they put in there, and then they could take off all of their cumbersome diving equipment and just work on the pipe while breathing air. It was really kind of a luxury. And so after Christopher and the 4 other divers he'd be with that day got their instructions, to get berth number 6 active again, they began getting all their gear together and going over who would be responsible for what once they got down to the habitat. And then once they were all ready, they made their way out to the boat. The 4 other divers that Christopher would be working with that day were men he had worked with many times before and men he would consider his friends. Their names were Kazim Ali Jr., Yusuf Henry, Faisal Kurban, and Rishi Nagasar. Once their boat had moved just off the coast and had stopped kind of roughly over the area where below the surface was this submerged berth number 6 vertical pipe and the habitat, the divers hopped off the boat and they swam straight down. They went up and under the side of this habitat wall and they entered into this breathable airspace right around the entrance to this pipe. And so they climbed up onto the platform, they took off all of their gear, and then once they were just in their wetsuits, they got to work. Now, the job was relatively straightforward. They just needed to basically pull a lever inside of the pipe that would then deflate the big inflatable plug that had been set inside of this pipe to seal it. However, when one of the divers reached down and began to pull on the lever, it was jammed, and so they needed a wrench to kind of free the lever. And so Kazim volunteered to go back to the surface and get a wrench because no one had one inside of the habitat. And so Kazim put his dive gear back on, he dove out from underneath this habitat, swam back to the surface, he talked to the folks on the boat, they handed him a wrench, and then he swam right back down, back inside of the habitat, and then once he poked himself back up, he handed the wrench up to the nearest diver. And that diver took the wrench, he turned back around to face the pipe, he reached down inside, and he began fiddling with the lever, and eventually he freed it. However, the second this lever was activated, something horrific happened inside of that space. We don't know exactly how this happened or what exactly could have been done to prevent it, but in short, the second that lever was activated, it began to deflate this big cork that had been plugging up this inactive pipeline for the past 4 years. And when that happened, it broke the seal, and suddenly all this low pressure air that was sitting in 1,200 feet of pipeline made contact with the extremely high pressure air that was inside of this habitat. And air likes to go from high pressure to low pressure. And so the second that seal was broken, the high pressure air in the habitat expanded down into the pipe. But this happened so quickly. It was almost instantaneous. It was almost like the pipe opening became the world's strongest vacuum, and it sucked everything inside of the habitat, all the air, all the equipment, all 5 men into the pipe. And it also began sucking in seawater. Basically, everything was going in this pipe. And so these 5 men, they don't have their scuba gear on. went from just standing outside the pipe to feet first flying into this pipe with all of their heavy equipment all around them, and there's seawater all over them. They're holding their breath. And so they get sucked down the vertical section, they turn the corner, and they get rocketed out to sea. They are on the 1,200 foot long section, the horizontal section, just blazing a trail. Now think about this. All 5 of these guys have no idea what's happened. They're on a breath hold. They are shooting down a pipe. They can't see anything. The space inside of this pipe is so narrow. It's 2.5 feet across. And so they're getting compressed. Their shoulders can barely fit inside of this pipe. And so you gotta figure that all of them are expecting to die. But eventually, the pressure in this pipe did equalize, at which point this vacuum phenomenon stopped up at the habitat, and actually the habitat kind of refilled with air. And when that happened, all the seawater that was getting pulled into this pipe also stopped. So no more air, no more seawater is going into this pipe. It's kind of like whatever went into the pipe, that's what's down there. And when this equalization happened, these men, who by this point are on a several minute long breath hold, they eventually begin to slow down and come to a stop. And by some miracle, they came to stop in a section of this horizontal pipe that was not totally flat to the seabed. It was slightly elevated, which meant there was a small air pocket where they stopped. And so they come to a stop and they just start gasping for air, and then they begin yelling out to each other, and they realize all 5 of them are alive, and they're all kind of roughly grouped together in this air pocket. And we know this because one of their cameras on their bodies was rolling when they were pulled into the pipe. And so we can't see anything because it's pitch black inside of this pipe, but we can hear them talking to each other once everything stops. And so over the course of this kind of chaotic initial volley of communication up and down the pipe, where again, these guys are on their backs, they can't move at all. They're completely kind of trapped in position. And even though they're in an air pocket, there is water kind of close to their face. And so they have this little area to breathe in. They're panicking. They're screaming at each other. But in this volley, they're able to figure out that Christopher was the closest to the way they had come into the pipe, meaning his head was closest to the vertical section closest to shore, and all 4 other men were right below him. And so Christopher knew if they were going to get out, their best chance was to backtrack, head towards the way they came in, which meant Christopher would have to lead them. And so Christopher kind of found it within himself. Again, we can hear him on audio, and he told the others to calm down and link their feet onto the person below them's shoulders. And so to do that, the only way these guys could move in this tight little pipe is just by pushing with their heels. And so painfully, slowly, these guys who are very badly battered at this point, they came flying in here surrounded by all their heavy equipment crashing into them. Guys had broken bones. They were really badly beat up, but they finally make their way until they're all linked, feet under each other's shoulders. And then Christopher, in the lead, began kind of going in reverse, inching their way up the pipe back towards the way they came in. Now, the reason they felt strongly that they needed to act right away and not wait for rescue is because they didn't really understand how this had even happened. They didn't know if at any moment more water was going to pour into this pipe. They also understood that there was limited air, and at some point they would suffocate. And so with that in mind, they begin this journey. And right away, Christopher reaches the first flooded section of the pipe. Now, you have to understand, they have no idea how long this flooded section of pipe is. And so once you start moving into this flooded section behind you, once you go underwater, you're either going to find another air pocket at some point, or you're going to drown. And so it would turn out that only Christopher and the guy right below him, Faisal, were willing and physically able to attempt this potential suicide mission. And so the others, they began panicking. The others who were not going to go, and they're screaming out for Christopher and Faisal not to leave them. You can hear it on audio. But Christopher and Faisal, they felt strongly that somebody has to go to the surface and get help. And so Christopher and Faisal, linked together, begin inching into this flooded section of pipe. Pitch black. They have no idea what's going to happen. They're slowly going under the water, and they just begin inching their way on a breath hold
And by some miracle, this first flooded section they entered into was not very long. And so both Christopher and Faisal were able to barely, coughing and gagging, get out the other side into yet another air pocket. And by an even bigger miracle, in that new air pocket, Christopher, above him, he managed to get one hand above his head, he felt scuba tanks, 2 of them. And he was able to take one of them and somehow force it past the side of his body down to Faisal. And so both men suddenly had an air tank. Now they had to kind of awkwardly pin the tank above their head. These tanks are not light. If you've not scuba dived, it's like pushing a pretty heavy weight. And they had the regulator, so the mouthpiece that actually gives you the air in their mouths, but they couldn't really hold the mouthpiece in place. It was this very awkward thing they were going to do. But this meant they could now enter much longer flooded sections of pipe and potentially make it out the other side. And so with their air tanks on top of their heads and their mouthpieces in their mouth, gripping down as hard as they can with their teeth, they continued to inch along with their heels, and they entered into more and more of these flooded sections of pipe. As they're doing this, they know they have a scuba tank, but they have no idea how much air is in these tanks. They can't see the gauge. And so it's kind of the same thing as going in on a breath hold. You don't know when you're going to run out of air because you don't know how long these flooded sections are. So you can only imagine how terrifying this must have been. But they kept on going, and finally, after hours of this, that Christopher and Faisal are going through these terrifying stretches of, hoping they can hold on to that mouthpiece and hoping they got enough air. They'd get through these flooded sections, hit the next air pocket. After hours of doing that, they reach this air pocket where Faisal starts to kind of lose it. And he starts yelling to Christopher in the total dark to stop, but he didn't have a reason, and Christopher could kind of sense that, Faisal is starting to lose it and we're running out of time here. And Christopher, he can hear the other divers that they had left behind in the beginning screaming out all the way back down the pipe. And so Christopher, he stayed composed and he tried to get Faisal to calm down and come with him. But when it was clear he wasn't going to, he told Faisal that, hey, I'm going to keep going alone then. I'm going to get us help and I'll be back for you. And so Faisal, he was still panicking and he yelled at Christopher not to go any further, but Christopher knew he had to go. And so with the sound of his friends screaming out for him to stop, Christopher again cinched down with his teeth on the mouthpiece, continued to push this air tank above his head, and he inched his way closer and closer to the entrance of this pipe. And after reaching a very long underwater section where he knows he's running out of air, his tank hit the kink in the pipe where it went vertical again, which meant right above him was the exit. The habitat is right up there. And so Christopher was able to kind of turn and swim up this vertical section until he popped up. And it was again another air pocket, except the water level in this vertical section was not close enough to the exit of the pipe to actually pull himself out, it was like Christopher was stuck at the bottom of a well. Like there's nothing he can do. But luckily there was a chain that was dangling down in arm's reach. And so Christopher grabbed the chain and just had to wait, having no idea if anybody was coming to get them. But eventually 2 rescue divers did get into the habitat, and they reached down and they pulled Christopher out of the pipe and they saved him. And when they brought him up to the surface, Christopher saw that Paria Fuel had their emergency response team on site, the Trinidad and Tobago Coast Guard was there, and it's clear they're getting ready to do some sort of rescue operation. And so Christopher, who's totally traumatized, he's badly hurt, he still ran up to authorities and told them, all 4 of my colleagues are still alive. I heard them banging in the pipes. I know they're in air pockets. You gotta go back down. You gotta save them. But ultimately, the authorities decided it was not safe to send rescuers down into this pipe. And so when Christopher found out they were not going to try to rescue his friends who are literally banging the pipe, he can hear them, he tried to jump back in the water to do it himself. And they stopped him. And then Christopher was rushed to the hospital where once he was admitted to the intensive care unit, he tried to check himself out to go back to the water to save his friends. But again, Christopher was stopped. For 2 whole days after Christopher was rescued from this pipe, his colleagues, the 4 other divers, remained trapped in the most claustrophobic, horrible situation imaginable, and they continued to bang on the pipe and make noises that could be heard on the surface, but nobody did anything. And so finally, on February 27th, the noises stopped inside of the pipe because all of the men died. They either died of suffocation because they ran out of air in the pipe, or they died from one of their injuries, or they attempted to do one of those long underwater sections of pipe on a breath hold because they didn't have scuba tanks, and they drowned. On February 28th, 3 of the divers' bodies were recovered, and the final body, the 4th diver, was recovered on March 3rd. It's unclear why Christopher and the other divers did not do something to equalize the pressure inside of the habitat and inside of this pipe before undoing the plug, because this vacuum effect, which is known as delta P, is actually easy to anticipate and relatively easy to prevent. But the investigation into exactly what happened and who is to blame is still ongoing. However, the only survivor, Christopher, and many other people who are following this case, they believe the 4 deaths are directly attributable to Paria Fuel, who were primarily responsible for not allowing a rescue operation to happen in those first 2 days, where you could clearly hear the sounds of these divers banging on the pipe.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our other studios podcasts, Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runful. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to watch hundreds more stories like the ones you heard today, head to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate